So it's my pleasure to present and moderate the second panel on the political economy of genocide and the obliteration of Gaza. We have a distinguished panel. The panelists that are in the room, we have Penny and Lara. Oh, we're back. David Whyte, is he on Zoom? He is?
Should be.
Okay. Well, we'll start with our first panelist. Do you want to? So our first topic will be the Nakba, liberation and decolonization through a political economic lens from 1948 to the Gaza genocide by Lara Eborno. And Lara Eborno is a Palestinian-American international lawyer and human rights advocate qualified in the U.S. and France. Lara, the floor is yours.
My presentation today is entitled Nakba, Liberation and Decolonization Through a Political Economic Lens, the Case of the Gaza Genocide. Before I begin, I would like to take a moment to remember the victims of the Israeli airstrike on the Fahmi al-Jarjawi school in Gaza City 2 nights ago. Like it regularly does, Israel bombed these displaced Palestinian families while they were sleeping, killing more than 35 people, including at least 18 children. As Patrick Wolf observed, settler colonialism destroys to replace. Wolf illustrated this logic by citing Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, who wrote, "If I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct." From its inception, Zionism was conceived as a settler colonial project. In 1895, Theodor Herzl penned a letter to Cecil Rhodes in his diaries, appealing to the imperialist and architect of British settler colonialism in Africa to support, quote, "something colonial in a colony to be founded in a piece of Asia Minor," in other words, Palestine. It was no secret that this something colonial would require force to bring about. In 1919, the King Crane Commission concluded that, quote, "no British officer consulted believed that the Zionist program could be carried out except by force of arms." In 1923, Jabotinsky openly admitted that Zionist colonization, even the most restricted, must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native population. Between 1897 to 1947, with the support of the British Empire, the Zionist movement established the institutional architecture for its settler colonial project. It created organizations which attempted to acquire Palestinian land, coordinate Jewish-only immigration and settlement, fundraise globally, and promote exclusive Jewish labor policies. The formation of the Haganah in 1920 provided a paramilitary force capable of enforcing Zionist objectives through organized violence. During this period, the majority Palestinian population was denied comparable rights. In 1925, Zionist banker David Levinton argued that colonization of Palestine should take place using economic means, that is, the accumulation and control of land and capital by Jewish financial institutions and other enterprises. Levinton's approach would eventually prove insufficient, as by 1945, the Zionist movement had only succeeded in purchasing less than 6% of Palestinian land, and Jewish people remained a demographic minority, despite extensive efforts to finance and incentivize settlement. As Zionist leaders long recognized, the project to establish a Jewish majority state in Palestine would not be fulfilled without the mass forced displacement of Palestinians. Between 1947 to 1949, this objective was violently realized when Zionist paramilitary groups committed over 70 massacres, driving 80% of Palestinian society from 78% of Palestinian land upon which a self-proclaimed Jewish state was established. The settler regime's next major land grab came in 1967 with the beginning of the occupation in the remaining 22% of Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza. While the Palestinian experience under Zionist colonization varies in the type and scope of violence depending on geography, often described as different laboratories of oppression, Israel's treatment of Palestinians anywhere they are reflects a single objective: to privilege Jewish Israelis in the distribution of land and resources, and to ensure that the fewest possible Palestinians remain on their land. Therefore, that Israel would seek to ethnically cleanse Gaza is not surprising. The majority of Gaza's population are refugees or descendants of refugees expelled from their homes in 1948 and denied their right to return. For the Zionist movement, whose founding mythology rested on the fiction of a land without people for a people without a land, Gaza has long represented a political and demographic contradiction, a physical and proverbial thorn in its side, as the living reminder of the ongoing Nakba, which Israel denies, and the enduring Palestinian right of return, which Israel has spent decades attempting unsuccessfully to extinguish. We also know that successive Israeli governments have consistently framed Palestinians as a, quote, demographic threat, citing fears that the Palestinian population growth would surpass that of Jewish Israelis. By 2021, there were roughly 6.8 million Jewish Israelis and 6.8 million Palestinians living between the river and the sea, including 2.3 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip alone. It's not difficult to understand why, absent mass displacement or extermination, the indigenous Palestinian population may have eventually outnumbered Jewish Israelis, thereby threatening the sustainability of the settler colonial regime. In 1948 and 1967, Israel's settler colonial expansion advanced under the fog of war. The same logic appears at work today. While Israeli officials publicly frame their ongoing campaign in Gaza in terms of self-defense and the necessity to retrieve hostages and destroy Hamas, these narratives functioned as hasbara, or propaganda, intended to obscure Israel's true motives and manufacture consent for Israel's crimes. In reality, however, Israel's leaders have repeatedly and explicitly affirmed their genuine intentions for the Gaza Strip, carry out a new Nakba, forcibly displace Palestinians, and permanently resettle the territory. In October 2023, a leaked document from Israel's Ministry of Intelligence proposed the mass expulsion of Gaza's population into Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Around the same time, Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich expressed support for the, quote, voluntary immigration, which should be understood as forcible transfer of Palestinians from Gaza to other countries. In November 2023, Israel's agricultural minister, Avi Dichter, proclaimed that Israel was, quote, now rolling out the Gaza Nakba. By December, an Israeli real estate firm responsible for building illegal settlements in the West Bank began advertising a new real estate project for settlements in Gaza. In January 2024, dozens of Knesset members organized a conference attended by thousands of Israelis devoted to planning Jewish settlement of Gaza. They even picked out the names of the new settlements, which were to replace the Palestinian cities. In May 2024, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu revealed the Gaza 2035 plan, which envisioned the territory as a demilitarized economic zone. The plan involved rebuilding from nothing, exploiting Palestinian gas fields for Israeli profit, and Palestinian labor to support the development of Israeli-led industries such as electric vehicle manufacturing. In February 2025, plans to colonize Gaza were elevated to the international stage when U.S. President Donald Trump announced during a joint press conference with Netanyahu that the United States would, quote, take over and, quote, own the Gaza Strip and redevelop it into, quote, the Riviera of the Middle East. By April 2025, over 800 Jewish Israeli families had signed up to move to would-be Gaza settlements. In May 2025, Netanyahu overtly declared for the first time since October 2023, Israel's intention to permanently, quote, control all of Gaza, adding that, quote, the war would only end on the condition of implementation of President Trump's, quote, revolutionary plan to depopulate Gaza. That same month, Israel's Finance Minister Smotrich admitted that within 6 months, Gaza's population would be confined to a narrow swath of land, with the remainder of the enclave, quote, totally destroyed. Meanwhile, the obliteration of Gaza has unfolded at an astonishing scale. By December 2024, Israel had destroyed over 92% of all housing and approximately 70% of all infrastructure. In May 2025, it was reported that since October 2023, the Israeli army had used over 100,000 tons of explosives, committing over 12,000 massacres in Gaza. And today, the Israeli military has turned over 70% of Gaza into a no-go zone, pushing Palestinians into non-contiguous, shrinking pieces of land within the Gaza Strip. Whether or not Israel succeeds in expanding its settler colonial project remains to be seen. Nevertheless, there can be little doubt that left to its own devices, Israel will not stop until it erases Gaza and its Palestinian owners and replaces them. Viewed through a political economic lens, settler colonialism creates vast opportunities for unjust enrichment for the settler regime and its partners, while imposing devastating losses on the colonized. So let's look now at the private companies and state-backed enterprises which are profiting as part of the ongoing Gaza genocide. The most direct form of enrichment occurs through the appropriation of land, assets, and resources. And as I already mentioned, the Israelis have already turned over 70% of Gaza into a no-go zone. With Israeli officials declaring their intentions to permanently control Gaza, the prospect of formal annexation of parts of or all of Gaza looms. Israeli military forces have also engaged in widespread looting. The Israeli army's loot unit has stolen approximately $30 million in cash from Gaza and Lebanon, and individual soldiers were also documented reselling stolen personal items of Palestinians online. Palestinian natural resources were also not spared. In November 2023, BP and other energy firms were granted gas exploration licenses in occupied Palestinian waters by the Israeli Ministry of Energy, flagrantly violating the Palestinian right to sovereignty over natural resources. And note the timing of this move. It was 1 month into Israel's bombardment campaign. A second layer of profiteering stems from the destruction itself. The genocide has fueled profits for arms, surveillance, and technology firms. In the first year, the U.S. provided Israel with $23 billion in military aid, funds that largely returned back to U.S. weapons giants such as Boeing, Lockheed Martin, RTX, General Dynamics, and Caterpillar. By late 2024, U.S. arms manufacturers were recording record profits resulting from Israel's assault on Gaza and the then expansion of its war on Lebanon. To give you an example, RTX, which manufactures the 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs that turned most of Gaza into rubble, saw an annual return of 82%, outperforming the S&P 500 by about 46%. This was in 2024. Israeli defense companies also saw windfalls. The state-owned Rafael 2024 revenue jumped 27% to $4.8 billion, with 54% coming from Israeli military contracts. Its order backlog hit a record $17.5 billion. Israeli aerospace industries reported a higher than ever backlog of orders in 2024, mostly for exports. As Antony Lowenstein documents in the Palestine Laboratory, Israeli weapons marketed as, quote, battle-tested on Palestinians have reached 140 countries worldwide. Arms deals also increasingly shape Israel's diplomatic relationships, often included in the normalization agreements with Arab states. Profiteering has even extended to private security and humanitarian aid schemes. Following Israel's relentless attacks on UNRWA, a private U.S. military contracting firm run by a former CIA officer was hired to man checkpoints in Gaza and oversee the delivery of humanitarian aid to Palestinians who passed biometric face scans, cementing Israel's efforts to weaponize the delivery of aid and increase surveillance of Palestinians. Understandably, this plan has sparked outrage for the plan's incompatibility with humanitarian principles. The country of Jordan has also reportedly profited up to $400,000 for every airdrop of aid into Gaza and up to $2,200 for every truck entering Gaza through Jordan. Tech companies have also profited. Google and Amazon's $1.2 billion U.S. cloud computing contract with the Israeli government Project Nimbus continues to provide surveillance and AI infrastructure for Israel's military. Microsoft's Azure enabled the Israeli surveillance of Palestinians and has been used by the Israeli Air Force's OFEC unit, which manages databases of potential targets for airstrikes. In parallel, Palestinians seeking to flee the genocide through the Rafah crossing were charged between $5,000 and $10,000 a person by a private Egyptian firm, Hilal, whose owner, business tycoon Ibrahim al-Organi, made at least $2 million per day, earning a reported $118 million in a mere 3 months. A third form of enrichment takes place once the destruction is complete. At that point, reconstruction presents a new frontier for capital accumulation. The interests lining up there are clear. Construction, cement, steel, real estate, energy, security, technology, and investment firms all stand to profit from reconstruction. On the flip side, Palestinians experiencing this have been dealt a severe economic toll. A UN, EU, and World Bank report estimated reconstruction alone will require at least $53 billion. Yet the impact of the Gaza genocide cannot be understood without understanding the context in which it arose. Decades of de-development, a 17-year siege, regular bombardment campaigns, a 56-year-long military occupation, and the 1948 Nakba have all eroded Gaza's economy. Consider that UNCTAD estimated that without Israel's 17-year-long siege, Gaza's gross domestic product would have been on average 77% higher than its actual level between the years of 2007 and 2023. As for the 1948 Nakba, Atif Kubursi estimated that Palestinian monetary losses alone, which were never compensated, equaled $1.1 billion. Nevertheless, the biggest barrier to Gaza's economic recovery is the ongoing genocide. Gaza can recover, but for this to happen, Israel must first and foremost cease its daily atrocities. As Dr. Fayez Abu Shamali, the former mayor of Khan Yunis, explained, do not believe those that say rebuilding Gaza will take 10 years or that rebuilding Gaza requires billions. This is an exaggeration meant to push people to leave the Gaza Strip and give people the impression that they will not be able to stay on this land. We, the people of Gaza, are capable of rebuilding it with any Arab assistance. The proof of this is the Khan Yunis municipality, which managed to restore the water supply, organize and clean the sewage networks, open the roads, and bring life back to Khan Yunis with nothing but a single old bulldozer. Through the efforts and determination of the people, we can rebuild Gaza. We are staying in Gaza and we will not leave this place. And I know I'm running short on time, so I'm going to close with just a thought for our audience. I really want to emphasize this point. As we discuss the genocide, it's very common to hear emphasis on the destruction of Gaza, and yes, this is true. But if we're only speaking about the destruction without emphasizing the capacity, the ability, and the will of the Palestinian people to remain on their land, their ingenuity, their brilliance, we may be doing more harm than good. It may lead some to conclude that Gaza is a lost cause, that nothing can be done. But there are still 2 million people in Gaza today, and they insist on living. And we must do everything within our power to ensure that they can remain on their land. I have one last sentence. Palestinian revolutionary George Habash understood that the real enemy is not Israel and Zionism only, but American imperialism, describing Israel as a, quote, bodyguard for American imperial interests. In this light, the Gaza genocide exemplifies the political economy of settler colonial violence, in which the elimination of Palestinian life and future is inseparable from global systems of extraction and profit. While ideology, geopolitics, and other drivers certainly play their roles in this colonial project, the material incentives sustaining this violence must not be overlooked. As others have observed, settler colonialism cannot be dismantled without dismantling the capital systems that feed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lara. Next, we're going to turn online. Hilal, are you there? Hilal?
Yeah, done.
Okay.
Thank you.
So
Yes.
Hilal will discuss the enforcement and accountability gap, in particular the crime of starvation. Hilal Eber is a professor of international law and the co-director of the Climate Change, Democracy, and Human Security Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And between 2014 and 2020, Hilal served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food. Hilal, the floor is yours, and we wish you a speedy recovery. We wish you were here with us.
Good morning, dear friends and dear Palestinian sisters and brothers. I really wanted to be with you, but unfortunate, my very unfortunate accident took us here in California rather than to be together with you. I'm very sorry about that. And also what we are talking about now, what's happening in Gaza, it is extremely concerning. And every day I start to listen in Instagram, Bisan. Bisan always starts, here I am Bisan, I'm still alive. Recently, she doesn't say anymore this because she has anymore no energy. She cries and tries to tell what was happening. So every day when I start my life now with Bisan, we are really preoccupied and how to go ahead and finish these days. For us, it's very, very personal issue. If we start right now my presentation, as we all start from the 9th of October 2023, the Gaza Strip has been subjected to a complete blockade and sustained military assault that has produced mass killings and injuries, forced starvation, famine, house demolition, infectious diseases, clean water shortages, destruction of agriculture and fishing fleets, perished livestock, as well as broken health systems. All indirect attacks to the livelihood have created much more loss of human lives than direct killings in battlefields. There is no battlefield in Gaza. The combat zones are homes, tents, hospitals, schools, food distribution centers, bakeries, markets. The targeting of health and aid workers, journalists, teachers, children, and pregnant women were not simply consequences of war or collateral damage, but they were victims of carefully planned, deliberately executed, coordinated state actions designed to destroy life in Gaza forever. These dire conditions were increasingly regarded around the world as an instance of textbook genocide. After 600 days, atrocities are continuing to assault in front of the eyes and ears of the entire world, even more severe than ever, and yet Gazans continue to show uncanny resilience. The convergence of military strategy, political shielding, and legal fragmentation has created one of the clearest famine cases of our time. And yet this famine seems exempt from any relevant accountability procedure. Starvation as a political tool is a weapon of genocide and a societal torture that creates slow, painful death and destruction of the current and future generation of the entire population. Based on clear and multiple sources of evidences, famine in Gaza is both a prelude to and a component of genocide that has profound societal ramifications. Using hunger as a tactic of war is not unique to Israel. It is one of the oldest weapons of warfare, from ancient conflicts to modern wars. Yet it remains one of the least prosecuted war-related crimes in both national and international courts. Hunger-induced atrocities, such as those witnessed during the Cambodian and Bosnian genocides, have largely gone unprosecuted. Establishing starvation as a distinct crime is difficult because famines can have many causes, such as crop failures, unequal distribution of resources, economic problems, and political conflicts. Also, hunger-related deaths are often attributed to infections and exhaustion, making it less convincing to blame starvation for many food-related deaths. The absence of convictions for starvation crimes under international law has resulted in the lack of precedent and impunity. Powerful states that have a lawmaking role in international level prefer to keep starvation crime rather obscure manner. They all used in the past in colonial and post-colonial setting and could be used in the future. However, never has this failure been more salient than in Gaza. Despite mounting evidence that starvation is being used by Israel many years as a method of occupation, oppression, and warfare against a besieged civilian population, accountability remains elusive, if not altogether absent. Gaza, in fact, exemplifies the broader structural and political barriers that make starvation a crime that is rarely, if ever, adjudicated. Unlike other starvation cases, such as Sudan, Gaza is fundamentally different. The siege is centralized, applicable to the whole of the Gaza Strip, state-led, and publicly well-documented. No escape, no exception. Israel controls every shekel, every sack of flour, every connection to the outside world. The UN Human Rights Council's Independent Commission of Inquiry report and several special rapporteurs have corroborated these findings, as well as reports from UN specialized bodies and respectively international NGOs. Gaza starvation and blockade has a long history. As we all know, during Israel's 17-year blockade of Gaza, it has researched how much food Gaza's residents need to survive at levels of bare subsistence. Israel even drafted a formula and put together caloric tables called Gaza Diet for this purpose. Israel entered the war with a vast amount of knowledge about the basic needs of Gaza's population and made a conscious choice to deny access to adequate supply of food and portable water. Average food availability in Gaza at best fall 1,400 calories per person per day, if it is positively thinking. Humanitarian ration is 2,100 calories. As a result, Gaza now globally a place where over 80% of the starving people are living there, which is an incredible statistic considering the tiny size and small population. A few months after the war began, mass starvation spread throughout the Gaza from north to the center and from center to the south. By December 23, When winter arrived, most Gazans were already living in tents or partly demolished buildings with no access to food, water, heating, cooking, and toilets. The UN coordinated famine review system called Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, which is IPC, and the FEWNet, the United States-based organization, both concluded famine was imminent. Actually, famine was there. Israel repeatedly denied starvation reports, and the US government blatantly ignored the dire warnings and the undeniable evidence. For a long time, almost all Western governments carefully ignored the words famine and genocide. The visibility of the crisis, the abundance of reliable evidence, plus the involvement of powerful actors makes starvation in Gaza both a test case of impunity for perpetrators and a tragic outlier with respect to international humanitarian law and morality. Accountability gaps and ongoing impunity in case of starvation crime has been widely discussed among international law scholars. However, until very recently, Gaza had never been cited as an example of siege starvation case when discussed criminality and impunity. This has to change. Famine never declared in Gaza Strip. The technical definition of famine itself carries political weight and implies legal and moral responsibility. The IPC, which I mentioned before, a globally recognized framework, defines famine based on specific three thresholds. Despite abundant evidence of catastrophic living conditions, severe malnutrition, and death from starvation, the IPC hesitated or reluctant to issue a formal declaration in Gaza. The excuse given was the inability to collect data during the war. The IDF has never allowed any international organization to enter Gaza, and the war conditions makes reliable data collection nearly impossible. Between 28th of April and 6 May, just recently, the World Food Programme and the IPC conducted a phone survey of Palestinians in Gaza. They asked what people were eating, how often, and what they were doing to get food. It was the 5th such survey since the outbreak of war 19 months ago. The IP results published in summary from the most recent one, 12th of May, estimated that almost 1 million Gazans, 45%, were already experiencing emergency acute food insecurity close to the starvation threshold. Although the assessment and declaration of famine are put forward as purely technical exercises, they are often intertwined with political dynamics that can significantly impact the timeliness and adequacy of aid. Declaring of famine in Gaza would increase political and legal pressure on Israel. This would trigger greater political and public scrutiny on states supporting Israel military or diplomatically. Moreover, a famine declaration would pressure on the UN and international community to confront their inaction and passive complicity. This reluctance and delay cause further suffering and underscores a critical aspect of humanitarian crisis in Gaza, helping to shield Israel from punishment or even authoritative censor initiatives. UN Special Rapporteur consistently called famine in Gaza. They received strong criticism along the lines that UN Special Rapporteurs are neither qualified nor empowered to declare famine. Enforcement gap, and we look at the humanitarian aid. Despite the establishment of monitoring mechanism with the UN Security Council Resolution 2720, which is 2023, this resolution has never been properly implemented. Israeli authorities consistently denied any wrongdoing, even when limited number of trucks are periodically allowed to enter Gaza. Most of them never reach distribution centers because of the formidable blocking obstacles when it comes to delivery. Israel accuses Hamas of stealing aid for its fighters, but hasn't provided evidence of this happening at scale. Even it hasn't prevented aid getting to the children who need it most. There are 3 humanitarian massacres happening in Gaza. We all know that, but the timing is very interesting. These are the revealing that attacking humanitarian aid was not only a weapon of war, but also it functioned as an integral part of genocidal plan, as well as Israel's arrogant behavior. The first incident was the Floor Massacre, 29 February 2024, a day after the World Food Programme reported that more than 500,000 Palestinians were at risk of famine. Israeli forces opened fire with snipers while the Palestinians were seeking food from 8 trucks on the coastal Al-Rashid Street in Gaza City. At least 118 Palestinians were killed and 760 injured. Survivors described the massacre was an ambush. Second incident, 1 month after, the World Central Kitchen, as we all know, an international NGO aid convoy attack occurred on 1 April 2024. 3 days after, an anonymous ICJ interim ruling included language suggesting the plausibility of genocide. This attack created international outcry as this NGO was a European and Israel's targets reached beyond the Palestinian aid workers because Europeans' lives were more important. Third incident, the US government, to avoid harsh criticism by the public, built a new temporary pier on the Gaza coast to facilitate transport of food aid. The multi-million-dollar pier closed within days due to bad weather, then reopened. On June 24, using US-built pier, Israeli soldiers infiltrated Nusayrat refugee camp, disguised in humanitarian aid trucks, killed more than 274 Palestinians, including 64 children, and injured over 700 more. It was a perfect scenario. The US paid for the pier, armed the Israeli forces, followed by offering diplomatic cover in the aftermath of the massacre. These 3 incidents were clear messages by Israel to the international community that no matter what international law principles obligated Israel, their behavior will not change, but on the contrary, it will be intensified. 3 months ago, on March 2nd, Israel refused to allow the entry into Gaza of a single truck of humanitarian aid or commercial goods, the longest period that Israel has imposed such a total blockade. Israeli Defense Minister Katz warned, gates of Gaza closed, gates of hell opens. On March 27, UNRWA left Gaza, followed by the World Food Programme, which ended its operations because it ran out of food to distribute. Most recently, Israel and the US organized privatized humanitarian aid called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation as an alternative mechanism for aid delivery. However, this initiative has faced criticism and skepticism from established humanitarian organizations, and its director recently resigned today, actually, citing concerns over its independence. Even the director, which is part of the mercenary of the US and Israel. The UN refused to take part because the system fails to respect international law and humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, independence, and neutrality. Experts are suspicious about the cooperation between Israeli private business people, former CIA operatives, and anonymous donors. This is surveillance humanitarianism, the food targeting counterpart to the IDF algorithms that select whom to bomb. Attack on UNRWA was all known with everyone. This is the long-standing critical role that played in Gaza and all in the region. After October 7, Israel unleashed a vicious PR campaign equating UNRWA with Hamas and blamed the agency for promoting extremism and terrorism. The US, the agency's largest donor, cut its entire UNRWA contribution during the Trump presidency. In October 24, Israel's Knesset passed a law banning UNRWA from activity. On April 28, 2025, the ICG listened to a variety of arguments supporting a UN General Assembly request for an advisory opinion on Israel's obligation to allow humanitarian assistance in Gaza and the West Bank. Israel boycotted the ICG proceedings. 39 states made presentation in The Hague, along with Palestine, the UN, the Arab League, and the African Union. Only the US and Hungary supported the Israeli case. Israel's foreign minister, Gideon Sar, called the ICJ anticipated response another shameful proceeding designed to delegitimizing his country, and branded the ICJ hearing as a circus. All these things, I think my time is completely ending. Concluding, I was talking about the double standard in ICC, ICJ, and other cases, but I think you all know, and when we have time, we can go more on that part. What is the conclusion? Gaza's uniqueness lies not only in the severity of the starvation, but in the clarity of the violation and the visibility of the suffering in real time. Yet it is far beyond the reach of enforcement. It is the most visible starvation crime in modern times. This is not a remote or inaccessible crisis. It is digitally documented, politically debated, and legally framed. The very clarity of the case exposes the structural failing of international law. Gaza has become a litmus test. If starvation so evident, so deliberate, and so publicly go unpunished, then the international legal system's promise of humanitarian protection and genocide prevention is hollow. It also reveals the limits of law and legality in a world where power, not principle, often dictates whether justice is attainable. Gaza is not simply a humanitarian catastrophe. It's a legal and moral failure of the international community. It reveals the structural impunity embedded in the criminal law, the political economy of humanitarianism, and the selective invocation of human rights principles. In doing so, it offers a stark reflection on the limits of legality in the face of political power. Let's hope Gaza ends the long-standing impunity of the starvation crime for all. Thank you very much for listening to me.
I'm Professor David Whyte, and I'm a professor in the School of Law at Queen Mary, University of London. This evidence is on ecocidal violence in Gaza and addresses the question, is it part of the genocide or is it a separate international crime? Well, first of all, the concept and term ecocide emerged in the context of the US anti-war and anti-imperialist movement, and it sought to describe the mode of warfare used by US forces in Vietnam that targeted the ecosystem as its modus operandi. And that modus operandi had two purposes. First, the removal of foliage, chemical clearing of dense forest areas to remove the visible obstacles from US surveillance and to make US ground operations easier by removing the Viet Cong's physical cover. Secondly, it eradicated the social base for any resistance or the capacity to exist outside US occupation. Mass defoliation forced people out of their homes to strategic hamlets, as the US military called them, settlements that could be more easily controlled and monitored. In his publication of a draft law of ecocide in 1973, Richard Falk launched a devastating critique of the demonic logic of counterinsurgency theory, stressing that the US's intention was to separate the people from the land by making the land uninhabitable, undermining any support at all for resistance. The evidence here set out here and in my written submission addresses the extent to which the destruction of ecosystems in the ongoing military attacks on Gaza, or the ecocide, can be regarded as an integral part of the genocide. As a point of departure, this presentation uses Part C of Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide as a point of orientation, i.e. the deliberate inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. A number of provisions in the Geneva Conventions also refer to the prohibition of methods of warfare which are intended or may be expected to cause widespread long-term severe damage to the natural environment and attack civilians through the destruction of environmental infrastructure. This similar provision features in Article 8 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, although there is, of course, a get-out clause that environmental damage needs to be clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated, and this would most likely be argued by the Israeli state. The evidence here, however, doesn't seek to establish a case in law that any of those thresholds have been met. Rather, it uses those thresholds as a departure point for the discussion that follows. I want to start with some comments on the geopolitical domination of key imperial powers in the Middle East and the roots of war. In that context, the establishment of the State of Israel is closely bound up with British and US geopolitical interests. Israel has been an important channel for both British and US interests in the region, and along with the cultivation of friendly relationships with some Arab states, has enabled both Britain and the US to maintain access to oil in the Middle East, and indeed has enabled Britain and the US companies to maintain a strong position as producers and traders of oil and gas in the region. The US relationship with Israel allows it to maintain its continuing military and economic presence, and I detail this more in my written evidence. This is an entry point into understanding the war on Gaza as an ecocidal war. The war on Gaza can't be described as a war for oil per se, yet war here is only, and the vicious attacks on Gaza can only be sustained because the US is Israel's largest military ally, and this is due largely to the geopolitical motivation for the US to preserve its influence in the region. It is the imperial thirst for oil that is fueling the attack on Gaza. At the same time, Israel's integrated energy strategy at the moment is aimed at positioning itself more centrally in the Middle Eastern economy and allowing it to consolidate economic relationships with the Arab states it seeks a closer political relationship with, including Egypt and the Gulf states. Israel therefore sees its integration into the Middle Eastern gas economy particularly as central to its aim of political regional integration more broadly. As I discuss in my evidence, the development of both the Levant Basin and the Negev Desert pipeline are an indication of Israel's diplomatic opportunism and its strategic positioning on this front. Israel sees its political integration in the region as closely bound to its positioning as a broker for the oil and gas industry between Asia and Europe. And therefore, we cannot understand what's going on in the Middle East unless we understand this wider context of where Israel fits and where the large global powers fit in a fossil fuel driven geopolitical environment. I want to address my comments particularly, though, to the introduction that I set out around issues of ecocide as the modus operandi for warfare. The environmental toll of military operations in Gaza, including carbon emissions, the desertification of arable land and the contamination of water and air, have been detailed in other submissions, and I have noted evidence of this extensively in my written evidence. But in summary, the cumulative effects of the unimaginable, really, levels of ground, air and water pollution have created a concentration of interconnected health crises that is almost unimaginable in its scale and impact on the people of Gaza. Deadly toxins, already ever present and part of the integral structure of Gaza's roads and buildings, have reached unbearable levels in its air, its groundwater and its land, not to mention the complete destruction of biodiversity in coastlines and wetlands. The collapse of agricultural systems, waste disposal and water management has meant disease proliferation and further environmental toxicity. The near total collapse of Gaza's water, sanitation and hygiene systems has created a public health emergency of unimaginable proportions. Gaza is enduring the systematic and intentional destruction of the natural environment for strategic military ends, and its purpose and effect is the eradication of the capacity for all life in Gaza. There can be no doubt about the very deliberate strategic aims of this strategy, given the overwhelming evidence that I document in my written.
And you've met Penny, a professor of law and globalization at Queen Mary, University of London, founder and director of the International State Crime Initiative. And Grace Spence-Green is a junior doctor working to challenge the narrative surrounding disability, medicine, and identity. She has conducted research on the impact of occupation on Palestinian children's mental health. Her book, To Exist As I Am, will be published with the Wellcome Collection this June on her experience as a disabled medical student and doctor. Penny, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wesam. Well, let's see if there are any glitches this time. Since October 7, 2023, Gaza has experienced what UNRWA's Commissioner General described as a pandemic of disabilities, with thousands of Gazans subjected by the Israeli occupation forces to the horrors of limb amputation, spinal cord injury, life-changing burns and acquired brain injury. There have been more than 4,500 documented amputations and thousands of cases. I mean, it's a difficult statistic to find, but there will be thousands of spinal and brain injuries as a result of the genocide. A disproportionate number of these injuries are afflicting children. A year ago, a World Health Organization analysis estimated that between 13,500 to 17,500 Gazans have suffered severe limb injuries, placing an unimaginable burden on, as we heard so eloquently yesterday, a near non-existent rehabilitation service. According to a report by UN humanitarian coordinator Sigrid Kaag, in less than a year, Israel has inflicted life-changing injuries on more than 22,500 people in Gaza, and that figure has surely risen very, very dramatically. Genocide is a process developing over many years. It begins with practices of institutional dehumanization and ends in erasure. And throughout, it involves periodic massacres, practices of apartheid segregation, systematic weakening, and social reorganization. I'm going to discuss that more in my submission to tomorrow's Chamber 3 submission, but for now, I think it's very important to understand that genocide is a process and not an event. In Israel's genocide of the Palestinians, the production of mass individual disability and the institutional disablement of a once functioning Gazan society are both critical elements in advancing Israel's goal, its organizational goal, of the annihilation of the Palestinian native. Genocide necessarily involves the prior and organized weakening of those to be eliminated. The process is attritional and includes state strategies of physical destruction through overcrowding, malnutrition, starvation, targeted disablement, epidemics, denial of healthcare, torture, and rape, and state strategies of psychological destruction through humiliation, abuse, persistent violence, denial of basic rights, and the undermining of community solidarity through collective punishment and collaboration. Evidence of both the physical and psychological components of Israel's strategy to destroy Gaza has long been provided by human rights organisations, and Paulina stressed the significance of civil society in this role. Systematic weakening is enabled through practices of segregation and apartheid and is most potent once the target group has been physically and socially isolated. When Israel's minister, then Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, on October the 9th, 2023, 2 days after the Hamas attack, announced the complete siege of Gaza with no electricity, no food, no water, no gas, Gaza's infrastructure had already been weakened to a point which made daily life in the Strip almost untenable. For the disabled, newly injured and chronically ill, access to life-saving and life-enhancing treatments and assistive devices had been restricted for many years. Before the current annihilation phase of Israel's genocide, Gaza had been placed under a brutally restrictive Israeli air, sea and land blockade, which the UN anticipated would make Gaza what it described as unlivable by 2020. During the 16 years prior to October the 7th, Israel exerted total control then over the movement of goods and people into and out of the enclave. Access to essential items was severely constrained or simply prohibited, including certain medicines, batteries essential for assistive devices, water and sewage pipes, concrete and diesel fuel, which Israel claimed had a dual function and could potentially be used to support terrorist infrastructure. Israel's prohibition on the import of carbon fibre elements that are used to stabilise and treat limb injuries and epoxy resins used in the production of lightweight and comfortable prosthetics has meant that the injured and the amputees of Gaza were and are being denied assistive technology that would allow for independence, mobility and a far greater quality of life. Decades of systematic and targeted attacks on Gaza's health and rehabilitative structures, coupled with almost 2 decades of blockade, and the now mass bombardment of hospitals and total siege have ensured that the newly injured, the chronically ill and the disabled are denied adequate healthcare and rehabilitation resources, such that they remain in a state of injury, rather than transitioning into what Jasbir Puar has called functional disability. To be functionally disabled, as opposed to being in a state of injury, represents for Israel an act of Palestinian resistance, a resistance that must be suppressed. Any assertion of Palestinian resilience and recovery somehow represents an existential threat to Israel's identity. By disabling the capacity of Gaza to heal and rehabilitate the injured, to feed the starving, to educate the young, to house the dispossessed, Israel attempts to weaken resilience and the possibility of resistance. Israel's calculated and wholesale and relentless decimation of Gazan healthcare represents something hitherto unseen in modern genocides. It might be termed sanaticide. By debilitating healthcare infrastructure, Israel has ensured that the injured are much more likely to become permanently wounded, placing an ever greater strain on Gazan health infrastructure, already disabled by the blockade. But in the annihilation phase of genocide, in post-October 7 Gaza, Israel has turned hospitals and rehabilitation services into killing fields. On the 13th of November 2023, the IDF posted but later deleted a tweet in which they called hospitals and ambulances legitimate military targets. As well as bombing hospital infrastructure, murdering patients and destroying incubators, ambulances, medications and life support systems, the occupying forces, as we heard so poignantly yesterday, has tortured, disappeared, and assassinated hundreds of doctors, nurses, physiotherapists, paramedics, and first responders. In April 2024, the Gaza Ministry of Health announced that some 500 medical sector staff had been murdered and 1,500 injured by Israel. Again, that number has increased dramatically, with 155 health facilities damaged and 35 hospitals and 53 health centres rendered non-functional. The ministry further reported that 309 medical staff at that time, in 2024, including hospital directors in Gaza, had been kidnapped and detained by Israeli forces. In Jasbir Puar's excellent book, The Right to Maim, she argued that in Gaza, and I quote, "the infrastructure that ought to sustain life is transformed into a system threatening life itself," end of quote. By creating a population which is heavily reliant on a healthcare system to survive, while simultaneously decimating that system, Israel has been able to create much more damage than it caused with the initial injury event. Causing an injury that makes one's existence reliant on a certain medical device or treatment vital to livelihood, for instance, sterile dressings, the use of catheters, stoma bags, feeding tubes, medication, antibiotics, painkillers, prosthetics, mobility aids, and then denying that resource spreads the stigmata of injury and disability far further than that of the individual person who has been disabled. In such a context, where the very structures designed to treat, assist, and rehabilitate are themselves dismembered, the injured cannot transform into the functioning disabled. Violently disabling large numbers of the group, and disabling the very infrastructure which supports life in the Gaza Strip are central means by which Israel has advanced this organizational goal that I talked about earlier of imposing a Jewish ethno-national state in Palestine. The consequences of using the Gaza Strip as a weapons laboratory have been profound. During the first Intifada, for example, the deployment of high-velocity fragmented bullets, which left a lead snowstorm, resulted in multiple cases of disability. Now, the policy that Israel employed at that time has been abandoned. It's simply mass death now replacing targeted disability. Dr. Adnan al-Bush, who we heard about yesterday, before he was tortured and raped to death, described what he witnessed working as a doctor and the way in which Israel creates a disabled generation by using destructive types of bullets and deliberately shooting protesters and others in the knees and in their joints. Hassan Abu Sita, a plastics and reconstructive surgeon who worked at Al-Shifa Hospital for 43 days, described in tweets the devastating impact of Israel's deployment of quadcopter drones with sniper guns. He said, "One night we had 30 injuries when they were sent to shoot at people trying to get to Al-Ahli Hospital." Reham Shaheen, a humanity and inclusion rehabilitation expert, suggests that the type of weapons used in Gaza mean that 70 to 80% of the people coming to hospital have been amputated or have spinal cord injuries. These particular injuries require immediate intensive care and rehabilitation and equipment provision. Spinal cord injury rehabilitation in the United Kingdom, for example, requires a minimum 3-month inpatient stay and the involvement of multiple different specialists for rehabilitation purposes. As well as sniper and gunshot wounds, vast quantities of explosives have rained upon Gaza, all of which directly contribute to amputations, traumatic brain injuries, spinal cord injuries, and other serious internal injuries, often due to collapsing rubble. There have also been eyewitness accounts of white phosphorus being used in densely populated areas of Gaza, all of which pose a high risk of excruciating burns and lifelong suffering. According to UNICEF, more than 1,000 children underwent limb amputations in the first 3 months alone of the genocide. and an estimated 10 children per day continue to lose one or more limbs through bombardments, crush or sniper injuries. As a consequence, Gaza is home to the largest cohort of child amputees in modern history. A report published in The Lancet in July 2024 reported that up to 186,000 or even more deaths were likely to be attributable to Israel's genocidal assault. This shocking, yet acknowledged by the author's conservative calculation, factors in the indirect and premature deaths caused by reproductive, communicable and non-communicable diseases that are the inevitable consequence of the total siege, mass bombardment, orchestrated starvation, mental and physical trauma, and the mass deaths and injuries inflicted by Israel on the population of Gaza. Evidence, as we heard yesterday, of hepatitis and meningitis outbreaks have been reported by Gaza's health ministry, and the highly infectious polio virus has been detected in sewage outlets in various areas of Gaza. Lack of access to sufficient food and water slowly disables a previously able population by causing vitamin deficiencies, muscle wasting, cognitive impairment, and immune suppression, increasing susceptibility to infectious diseases. While physical injuries and the consequences of starvation and illness in the context of genocide are so extensive as to be difficult to enumerate, the scale of mental health damage will impact every single Gazan. The first detailed report from Gaza on the genocide and mental health exposed what Victoria Britain has called an ocean of need. The scale of mental trauma and its attendant pathologies of PTSD, depression, anomie and more is incalculable. Nonetheless, the Gaza Community Mental Health Program anticipates that as the war continues, every child will need mental health support. And what of the previously disabled at a time of genocidal disablement? Haunting images of families impossibly pushing antiquated wheelchairs through rubble and destruction as bombs explode behind them. The starving child with cerebral palsy, Yazan El-Kafane, staring pleadingly from a stretcher in Rafah's Abu Yusuf al-Najjar hospital. Noor al-Huda, an 11-year-old girl with cystic fibrosis, admitted to Kamal Adnan Hospital, suffering from malnutrition, dehydration and a lung infection. The deaf sisters, Iman and Abir, who cannot hear the bombs or the warnings of those around them. Or Muhammad Bar, with Down syndrome, who could not understand the murderous intent of Israeli soldiers as they invaded his home with their dog, who was eventually to murder him. These are the faces of disability in Israel's genocide. Evidence from other genocides, notably the Holocaust and Rwanda, suggests that some of the earliest and most damaging effects of genocide are likely to be felt by the existing disabled community. Following 16 years of an illegal blockade, which, as I said, systematically and comprehensively weakened the whole Gazan population, disabled people were disproportionately impacted, having long been denied adequate access to the liberating assistive devices available in the West, including power-assisted attachments for wheelchairs, crutches, latest development prostheses, and hearing aids. Gaza's disabled population face a host of extreme barriers as they experience the destruction of genocide through the lens of their own disability, in effect becoming doubly disabled. As Israeli bombs rain down on civilian homes and in the wake of the relentless stream of evacuation orders, the medical and physical assistive devices essential to health, well-being and ultimately life are frequently lost, left behind or destroyed in the chaos of terror and flight. The disabled become separated from their essential caregivers, a terrifying situation for people who rely on trained others for their most basic daily needs. Without catheters and other continence essentials, adaptive toilet seats, wheelchairs, prostheses, walking frames and other mobility equipment, hearing and sight aids, as well as life-saving medications, disabled people become dangerously vulnerable. For those members of that population relying on total parenteral nutrition, TPN, and other forms of medical tube feeding, the impact is equally devastating, immediately devastating. Electric wheelchairs and other assistive devices require a constant source of power. The siege renders these devices unusable, and the consequences can be devastating. As we heard yesterday, that Rafah is entirely without electricity. Without electricity, lifts don't function, rendering the many physically disabled who live above ground floor in Gaza's high-rise apartment blocks unable to evacuate. In an orphanage in northern Gaza, evacuation was an impossibility given the very high care needs of the 12 children who were disabled in its care. For those able to flee, leaving accessible homes and supportive devices for a future of uncertain inaccessibility imposes an added terror. Over 90% of the population of Gaza have been forced to flee their homes. I think it's 95% now, sometimes multiple times, and the tents and shelters to which they have fled are extremely inhospitable homes for those who require assistive devices, disabled toilets, medical mattresses and sterilised conditions. For the disabled whose mobility was impeded, death then becomes the most obvious consequence. And to conclude, Israel's mass annihilation solution for the Palestinians of Gaza has followed decades of state-orchestrated dehumanization, apartheid, sporadic violence and systematic weakening. The disablement of the Gaza Strip through bombardment, ground invasion and siege and starvation means that every single Gazan trapped within its narrow confines has effectively been disabled. The purposive lives that they lived, the places where they loved, worked, socialized, maintained health and were educated, have vanished as homes, schools, hospitals, universities and public offices have been obliterated. Through the wholesale senaticide, Israel has ensured that death rather than functional disability now follows injury and trauma. Thank you.